There are 294,000 religious congregations in the United States. Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish traditions share a commitment to social justice. They shelter the homeless, feed the hungry, and provide counseling, health care, and daycare to those in need. Working together with elected officials at local, state, and national levels, faith-based individuals are making an impact.
Hello, welcome to Making an Impact. I'm Gretchen Ike. Our topic is interfaith, interreligious advocacy for social justice. And our guests to help us look at that topic in some detail are Rabbi Lynne Landsberg, who is the Associate Director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, and Father Joe Hacala, who is the Director of the National Office of Jesuit Social Ministries, both of them located here in Washington, D.C. Let's look first of all at why religious agencies have Washington offices. What do you do here?
Well, that's a good question, Gretchen, because I think it's one of the most well-kept, unintentionally well-kept secrets in the religious world that almost every religious denomination has an office in Washington to do social justice advocacy. And when people out in the pews in our congregations find out that we do in fact have an office in Washington, that's the first question. What do you do? What do you have the office for? Our office was set up in 1965 to help implement the resolutions that our organizational body wrote to reflect the concerns of, in this case, the Reformed Jewish community. What do we do once we write a resolution about a particular issue? Well, we have to then try to affect public policy on that issue, and the best way to do that is here in Washington. And so an office was set up here to help with that advocacy process.
So how do you actually try to affect public policy?
Well, we do it in a number of ways. We will address issues of concern to the Reformed Jewish community by actually making members of Congress aware of these issues, or their staffs aware of these
conversations with staff,
phone calls, information flow by giving them actually written information, being available for them to call us if they need further clarification, and in addition getting the information about what's happening on Capitol Hill out to our congregations so that people out in our congregations can begin to work in the grassroots sense on issues of concern to them.
Is it the same within the Catholic community, Joe? Do you have your office for similar purposes?
Gretchen, it's very similar. I think not only for Lynne and myself from the Jewish and Catholic tradition, but also very much there is a large Protestant representation on Capitol Hill from a social justice perspective. And our office, similar to Lynne's, was set up out of the justice struggles, the civil rights struggles, and other struggles of the late 60s, really to help us to integrate more faithfully our mission as Jesuits, really to integrate faith and justice in our lives, in everything we do, and in everything that we are. And so we do a number of things to help us to do that as Jesuits, to keep us authentic and truthful to our own tradition, and to plug into persons in the grassroots. So, for instance, our office has really a threefold purpose. The first is an educational service that we provide to Jesuits and our collaborators in the field throughout the country, a number of other Catholic constituents. Growing out of that educational research and ministry and service that we provide, background on the issues, etc., that leads us in, like UAHC and other groups, into advocacy for justice directly on Capitol Hill. There are a number of ways that we do that advocacy. Writing letters to Congress, lobbying directly members of Congress, phone calls, civil disobedience actions on particular occasions in Washington, D.C. with larger constituencies, working in collaboration. In the third purpose of our office, Gretchen, a very important one that brings us together, is really one of networking and collaboration together, that we work not only as Jesuits or as Catholics or as Jews, but we work really as one voice, in a sense, of the religious community.
How is that possible? I would assume that each of your national agencies has very different policy statements, as would all the different Protestant groups. Why and how do you work together?
You would think that we would have very different positions, and in some cases we do, but for the most part there's a real interfacing of our concerns and our issues, and it's actually works very easily. There are somewhere between 28 and 32 groups that work together in Washington through the Interreligious Staff Council, the Washington Interreligious Staff Council, also known as WISC. And we coordinate through this coalition on a wide range
Like
of
what would
issues.
be examples of some of the issues that you work on together?
Well, the issues would range from domestic issues like child care, homelessness, and housing to international issues or foreign policy issues like Central America or South Africa.
So you're saying the policy is not that dissimilar, and where you have similar policy, you work together?
That's right.
And why would you choose to do that?
I think for a number of reasons, Gretchen. I think maybe the best answer to that would really lie in the reason that we do this advocacy. I think our traditions are very similar. I think we do that rooted deeply in our religious faith. It's rooted deeply in the Scriptures, in the prophetic tradition, for instance, of the Old Testament. We do that from a Christian perspective, from the perspective of the New Testament. We do it, I think, not only in an isolated period of time here in the late 20th century, but we do it in concert with the religious traditions of the lived tradition and lived history through the ages, where there has been a strong emphasis of the churches on social justice issues, of a concern for the poor, for the marginalized, for the underclasses, if you will. I think all religious traditions share that.
How does it strengthen your work, though, to work with Catholics and Protestants and Jews all in a collaborative fashion?
Well, I think that's a very important point, and that's we do it out of a strong sense of social justice, both within our own teachings and our own hearts and minds. But there is also the practical side of it, and the practical side of it is when we band together and say, for example, if we walk in to visit a congressman and we say, we represent 1.3 million Reformed Jews, 2 million Baptists, I'm making up numbers as I go along, 3 million Catholics or whatever, that we represent a wide range of religious perspectives, but we all agree on this one issue of importance from a religious perspective. Mm-hmm. That carries a lot of weight, and it carries much more weight than if we visited individually only representing our own faiths. When you work in coalition, you have a broader base from which to get your support to begin with, and you represent to those who create our public policy a broader base of support.
Is the coalition always only religious?
It
Do you ever
depends
work
on the
with
issue.
secular groups as well?
Yes, we often work with secular
Yes.
groups. It depends on the issue we're working on.
I think that actually strengthens our advocacy, Gretchen. Here in Washington, there are a number of very effective and respected secular groups that we collaborate with very closely. I think of something like the Arms Control Lobby, a coalition of about 50 or 60 groups working on peace issues, and I think we've had a great impact on things that are happening in the world today, the thawing of the Cold War, a number of other changes in Central America, the hopes for peace in Nicaragua, hopefully someday in El Salvador. Something like COG, the Central America Working Group, that has been deeply immersed for years in trying to affect significant legislation affecting refugees and Central Americans. And so our working with the Religious Coalition and the other advocacy groups, I think, has been a very successful coalition. I think we could point to success stories like the issue of Contra Aid. I think over the years, as I talk to legislators and friends and staff persons, I think they point to our presence as religious witnesses and the coalition as a very important mix.
How about an example of where you see success in this religious advocacy, cooperative religious advocacy? Do you have one you'd like to share?
I would point to a number of issues. I think a couple years ago there was a lot of publicity around the Contra Aid issue, for instance, which is coming up now in terms of new possibilities for peace in Nicaragua surrounding the elections at this time, et cetera, et cetera. For years, as you know, there was a pretty much strong support in the Congress for funding the Contras.
President Reagan's policy.
President Reagan's policies. And over the years, there was an increasingly strong presence in religious witness calling for peace and opposing the direct funding of the Contras in Nicaragua. I think that coalition working together significantly changed the vote a couple years ago, $50 million on Contra Aid, that helped provide the possibilities for peace that we see happening in that country now, and hopefully that will continue to happen in the years ahead. A number of people credited the religious witness with significantly being present and providing background information that allowed that change in the mind of Congress to come about.
You had actually a personal illustration of that, didn't you, in a visit with a congressperson?
I did, Gretchen. As you look at success stories, if you will, in Washington, and I've been here 6 years, I think, Lynne, about the same time, there are not a lot of successes in Washington. In this type of work, in a sense, it's really from a faith-based perspective, and by the nature of our work, in a sense, we're swimming upstream. We're being prophetic, and so there are not a lot of success stories. I recall one a couple years ago, at the time of that particular vote that I alluded to, the $50 million aid proposed continued aid for the countries in Nicaragua. And I remember at that time visiting with a congressperson from my home state, who was one of the so-called swing votes. As you know, with legislation here in Washington, many of the people are on one side of the issue and the other, and there's a small number in the middle, frequently, who are swing votes or swings, so-called, who affect the legislation. And this particular congressperson was one of those swings. And so I was visiting him. He was gracious enough to receive me with some other members of our office staff over lunchtime, invited us in as he was eating a sandwich. And while we were talking, sharing some information from Impact, some background materials on Nicaragua, Central America, on peace in general, he apparently was impressed. He had formerly voted every vote prior to that to support the Contras. You could tell he was open. We were changing, I think, his mind by our presence, by our witness, by what we were saying. In the course of the conversation, the telephone rang, and the congressman picked up the phone and said, "Good afternoon, Mr. President." And it was President Reagan, who had targeted this person as one of the swing votes and was there, as we were, trying to influence his vote. So after listening to him for a few moments, congressperson said, "Mr. President, I very much appreciate your call and your interest. I'm sitting here now with a Jesuit priest and some other religious representatives from the Washington community, and quite frankly, they're making more sense to me right now than you are." So I would say that was at least one of my success stories that I can point to.
That's a wonderful success story.
Yeah.
How about you, Lynne? Illustrations of how you work, and that's kind of a hard one to top.
It is. I've actually only been here, thank you for thinking that I've been here for 6 years, but I've really only been in Washington for a year and a half, and it was actually the stories I heard about the success, or at least the impact, that the religious community was having in Washington that made me want to leave the congregational rabbinate and come to Washington to help here. But we not as dramatic a story, but just recently we were trying to help the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, which is a group of 170 organizations working on civil rights issues. We were trying to help them find co-sponsors to the newly introduced Civil Rights Act of 1990, and they asked us to help with a number of representatives and senators. At any rate, one of the senators that we were asked to influence was our own Specter of Pennsylvania. And so we called, knowing that Senator Specter was Jewish, we called a number of the rabbis in Pennsylvania and asked them to call his office. And about 2 hours after we made the calls to the rabbis, the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights got a call from Specter's office saying, "He's signed on to the bill and you can call off the rabbis now."
That's good.
We're going to take a break in a couple seconds, but when we come back, I do want to get us into the controversy of what you're involved in, because in many respects, the issues that you're taking on are not issues that everyone in your congregations would agree with. And I think there is often concern about who speaks for us and how do we speak, and how do we deal with the controversy that's inherent. We'll be right back. Thank you.
I was going to take a job with that engineering firm in New York. I got a better offer. I'm building schools overseas with the Peace Corps. The pace is a little slower than New York, but here I'm getting grassroots experience I couldn't get anywhere else. The way I look at it, the world can wait 2 years for another 40-story smoked glass high-rise.
Peace Corps, the toughest job you'll ever love.
Welcome back. We're talking with Rabbi Lynne Landsberg of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism and Father Joe Hacala, the Director of the National Office of Jesuit Social Ministries. And we're looking at that thorny question of the controversy involved in taking on public policy issues as you both do in your work. Who authorizes you to speak? Do you speak for all Reformed Jews? Do you speak for all Catholics? And if not, who do you speak for?
That's a very good question. That's the second most asked question when we probably won't go around speaking and people find out what we do. I can only speak for the Reform movement. We certainly do not speak for the entire Jewish community. When we speak, we only speak for the Reform movement, and we have a very democratic process by which we reach certain resolutions and positions on issues. And without going into the whole, because it would be
That's fine.
very boring, we have representatives from each congregation come to a plenum session. We have over 4,000 delegates, a total of Reform congregations come to a biennial session where resolutions are brought up and debated. The resolutions are sent to congregations beforehand where they can be looked over. There's a process by which they're amended, and by the time they're actually voted on, most congregations have seen them. Those congregations who pay attention to these things have seen them and voted on them and already submitted their thoughts on them and their additions, and then when they're voted on, it has to be a clear majority, and then we act. Our office can only act according to the language of the resolution. We cannot go beyond the language of the resolution.
Is it similar for you, Joe?
It is, Gretchen, yes. Our office actually specifically speaks only for the some 5,000 Jesuits in the United States, and through defined parameters, as with Lynne. We in no way take it upon ourselves to speak for the 50 million plus Catholics in the United States, although we work very closely in association with, in collaboration with the United States Catholic Conference and other Catholic and religious groups around the country, for instance.
Who also do legislative
Yes,
work and public
advocacy
policy work.
and lobbying, and in my 6
On
years in
social
Washington,
justice.
yes, there have been no significant disagreements on what we do. I think the question that Lynne addressed is a terribly important one. I think the question of who authorizes us, I think it is really, in a sense, it is our religious tradition, it is our church bodies, the statements, the Word of God and the Scripture, all of that. From the Catholic perspective, for instance, bring it up to date a little bit, the recent encyclicals of the U.S. Catholic bishops on peace and the economy in the United States, for instance, very strongly point out our scriptural, our religious traditions, and they point in specific directions, not as mandates of the faith, but as inspirations and as callings for us to really be deeply concerned for the poor and for the oppressed and the underclass. And that is really, I think, the one specific root that we share of a concern for the poor. Here in Washington, you see a lot of lobbies representing a lot of self-interest groups. There are few paid religious lobbies representing the poor of our country. And I think that's what we share in common. And that's what comes out of these traditions, the teachings of our church, and our statements on justice.
And I think it's rather than a vicious circle, it's a wonderful circle, because what comes out of our faith then adds to our faith.
Exactly.
Because what comes out of our faith tradition, we then bring both not only to Congress, but we speak to our congregations about it, and our congregants then find some purpose, some way to voice their inner concerns and their inner beliefs and their commitment. And it's really an empowering process of faith.
Exactly.
How do you do that? How do you involve people in congregations? You said earlier this is the work in Washington is sometimes the best kept secret.
Yeah.
What ways do you?
It's hard to do because the best way to do it is face to face. And I know that Joe's travel schedule, as most of the people who work in the Washington office's travel schedules, are crazy. We travel around the world like jet setters, but in baggage class, going from congregation to congregation, explaining what we do, and then explaining the issues to our congregations, and hopefully inspiring them to act. And usually they do respond very well.
Helping them make the connection between their tradition
That's
and
right.
the contemporary issue.
And in most cases, the congregations are already there on local issues. There are social action committees, or there are people within the congregations who are already committed and acting within their local congregations. But what they don't understand, and what they're very happy to find out, is that each of them can make a difference by taking what they're doing locally, expanding it, and also directing it toward Capitol Hill.
That's right.
Joe, you make an additional connection because Jesuits are worldwide. right? You
That's right, Gretchen. And I think, just to answer that question, to pick up on Lynne's answer, I think probably the most effective way to activate people in terms of consciousness raising, education, whatever that might be, is really some direct contact with the poor, and some sense that we're not here, in a sense, to help the poor, but in a radical sense, what, for instance, the U.S. bishops are calling for in their pastoral on the economy and on economic justice, is the involvement and the participation of the poor themselves in the decision-making processes which help affect legislation. And that is terribly important. And examples, for instance, I could think of one like El Salvador, the recent tragedy in El Salvador of the murder of my 6 Jesuit brothers and 2 women collaborators there, co-workers, really was a very concrete case of ways in which we could be involved, not only here in the United States, but seeing that what happened there in El Salvador was really affected by the foreign policy of the United States government. And that we're talking about not only the murder, for instance, of 6 Jesuits there and the destruction of a university community, but rather the deaths of 70,000 poor. And when Jesuits and others around the country, Reformed Jews and Protestants, came to see by their visits down there, their contact with the poor and the refugees here in Washington and elsewhere in their advocacy work, the fact that this really was the case and there was an injustice that our country was perpetuating on the poor of that country, it has activated a widespread network currently to help bring about change, to affect social change and policy there. And I think that is currently very effective, and hopefully it will bring about some significant change in our policy.
It's really something very unique that the religious community brings to the Congress or the White House or the government agencies, in that it does have such an international flavor. It has congregations all around the world from whom information is drawn and perspective is drawn on what the impact is of our government's policies in those various nations.
Exactly. Certainly one of the most powerful prophetic voices in Washington and on Capitol Hill the last several months has been that of Father John Sobrino, the famous Jesuit liberation theologian, who was the only member of that Jesuit community at the university in San Salvador who was not murdered because he was out of the country at the time in Thailand working with refugees. And his presence here in Washington over the last several weeks, which has been a real grace for me, for instance, has called forth the truthfulness of what we're about, has called us to work in the name of the poor of El Salvador to help bring about social change for justice and peace. And that has been a real inspiration for us, and that has been a powerful voice in the halls of Congress and with members of staff and the religious community in general. So that is a very effective linkage.
And then here at home, I think that the religious community helps the poor here, empowers the poor here to a certain extent through similar means. This past October, Housing Now have brought 250,000 people to march for the on behalf of the homeless and to advocate housing for all. Well, prior to that march, on the Thursday and Friday before that march, were 2 days of lobby days that were really, for the most part, put together by the religious community, where the homeless from various communities across the country came to Capitol Hill, sat in offices, well, first sat in rooms in Capitol Hill buildings to be briefed on the issues, and then went, not dressed in their Armani suits, but dressed in their cleanest sweatshirts and sweatpants, went into their congressperson's office and sat there and said, I'm homeless for the following economic reason, and I need your help. It was the first time for most of those congresspeople that they actually met homeless people face to face and heard that they had a voice and a mind and a will. And for the homeless people, they were empowered. Never did they ever think that they were going to be walking the halls of Congress and talking to their congresspeople. But it was the local religious communities that raised the funds for them to be able to come in, and then the religious communities in Washington that set up those lobby days and those appointments and allowed them that access and that conversation.
That's right. There's another important linkage here that I think it's important to mention, and that is the role of many groups in Washington like Impact, who enable us, in a sense, to be in touch, to educate our grassroots constituency, to teach methodology and skills for advocacy. Impact, for instance, which the 3 of us are closely involved, prepares materials. And these 2 pieces in particular, I know, Gretchen, an update on religious persecution in El Salvador and this background piece on Central America were very helpful for the 5,000 Jesuits or so and the others to whom we circulated it, and many other, the 10,000 or so members of Impact. It helps us, in a sense, to have some information and background, information which, in a sense, came from the struggles of the poor in El Salvador, then has been shared up here, leads to action on Capitol Hill. So this is a very important service. Impact, for instance, also recently published a a handbook, a concern for into action, an advocacy guide for people of faith, which has enabled many of us to look at concrete ways in which we can help affect legislation, raise consciousness, help bring about a more just world. These are very important services that are provided by local offices here in Washington, like Impact, and I know they're very important for us as Jesuits.
We should mention that you, Joe, are the chair of Impact, and Lynne is on the board of Impact. So, Impact is the coalition of 24 national religious agencies working together on public policy issues.
Yes.
Yeah. How do Reformed Jews relate in terms of educating their members about legislative issues, and how is that connected up to Impact?
Well, we also have a number of our members who are subscribers to the Impact Information Network and get the information that Impact mails out. In addition to that, we have what we call the High Impact Network, which is about 10 times a year on issues of urgent importance. We send out action alerts to our subscribers and members of our congregation, specifically outlining what the issue is, what they need to do, how they can do it, and when they have to do it by. And the reason we do this, we do it not only through that publication, but we'll also make calls, as we did in the case of finding co-sponsors for the Civil Rights Act of 1990, and through other communications. But the reason we do it is because what we believe is that public policy can be changed, but it can be changed in a number of ways. Locally, we affect our communities because we do acts of loving kindness, and those need to be continued. But I think, as I know you do, Joe, and the others of our community believe, that what we need to do is shift from kindness to justice. And the only way to shift from kindness to justice is to begin, because it's not that there's not enough food out there, or there's not enough kindness out there to feed the poor, to clothe the naked, but that there isn't enough political will, and that's what we are trying to engender, is that political will to change public policy so that all Americans are involved in social justice, and not just the communal agencies.
And I think an additional message that you're, if I hear you correctly, that you're saying is that if people in religious communities take seriously the religious tradition that they come out of,
right.
They are propelled into the public arena to try to...
Our faith is really lived out fully in justice. The two are very closely integrated in our life and our ministry, and I think that's what we're really about.
I want to say thank you to both of you. We're out of
Pleasure.
time. It's been
Thank you.
delightful to
Thank
have
you,
this
Gretchen.
conversation. And
Thank
thank you for watching.